right. Well, my computer says 7, so I think I'm gonna get started. Actually, my computer says 4 because it's on Seattle time, but that's okay. I know what I mean. Welcome to my panel. It's about Gunpei Yokoi, someone you guys might know about from Nintendo. He unfortunately is no longer with us, but there's a whole lot to say about him, a whole lot of impact he's made on Nintendo and how they still operate to this day. And there's way more to say than will fit in this panel, so I'm going to skip a whole lot of stuff, and that sucks, but that's just kind of what we have with an hour here. So that's me. I'm Kelsey. I have a YouTube channel, and you can follow it. I talk about game history and stuff, but that's not really important. It doesn't go. I can't. I'll sit up a little bit higher here, by which I mean I'll like give myself a booster seat. I'm not very tall. All right, so yeah, there's a lot to say about Gunpei Yokoi's early life, and it's something that's not really talked about. He, in his life, was not someone who really did interviews. He was not sort of this public face of Nintendo like people like Shigeru Miyamoto or Satoru Iwata. He was very much real Nintendo behind the scenes, wasn't on camera. But there was a book published about his life in which he gave a whole lot of interviews right before he died. And in it, he talks a lot about his childhood. And it's actually pretty interesting. That sort of gives an insight as to how he was who he was and why he had all of these ideas and why he really was like the perfect fit for Nintendo. So it's kind of random, though, because he came from a very normal Japanese family. It's not like he was a family of artists and inventors and mad scientists. But he just kind of always loved to work with his hands. He, studied piano. He did judo. He did all kinds of just hand-related things, I guess. And he was bored with all the toys and stuff that were normal in Japan in his childhood. And so he would build his own. He worked near a carpentry workshop. He would take scraps of wood. He would build his own toys. He just always liked to tinker. And he's a lot of things that he claims he invented before Nintendo, too. And I have no idea. This is all personal accounts from him, so there's no way of verifying this. But he does claim he invented the first cassette player in a car, and he says that he liked to prank people by playing the baseball game from 2 nights ago, but at a time when a baseball game would not be being played at 8 a.m. or something, and freak out the other motorists who are like, wait, there's a game on? What? And he was actually getting a little bit of media recognition all the way back to his college days, because he was really into model trains, and his dad was like, you are leaving your toys all over the house, you tinker too much. And so he created this storage, this kind of like pop-out model train thing where you could basically fold up the whole thing and put it away. And that was really ingenious to this train magazine, I guess. So they ran a whole article about him. And this was a quote he said in this book, actually. He said, "My life is always centered around creating. As soon as I started tinkering, I forget everything else. I declined dates, and instead I worked passionately into the night." He does mention many times that ladies love him. I don't know how self-serving this book was. but he always declined them because he liked creating so much more. So he always put his inventions and his tinkering and all of that before studying. So he went to Doshisha University, which was an electronics university in Japan, but he was a very poor student. He said he would always try to find the easiest way to find his ranking was to start from the bottom of the list and look up. Instead of studying, instead of doing his work, he would actually go out onto the sea with his friends, and he likes to talk about how he built a harpoon gun from his friend's boat, and they would harpoon fish. And as you can see with his awesome monogrammed diving suit here, he took it very seriously, a lot more seriously than he took school. But being that this was a big electronics university, all of his friends and all of his colleagues went to like the big electronics companies. They went to places like Sharp and Casio and all of those other places that were actually electronics companies. Back in the early 60s, Nintendo did not make electronics. They'd never made electronics, to my knowledge. They were just making playing cards, pretty much, some toys here and there. So he, when his friends were kind of going off to these other big electronics places, he was like, well, I'll just move home and I'll find something around there, I guess. And there was this little playing card company called Nintendo. They were being required by a new law that had just passed in Japan that they needed an engineer on staff. They needed someone who could repair machines any factory with a certain amount of electricity that they were producing now had to have someone like him. So they're like, all right, I don't know why we really need an electronics engineer, but here's a job, I guess. I do want to address the very first myth, because this brings us to his job at Nintendo. This is something I hear all the time. It's on IGN, it's on a lot of places, and it's just straight up not the truth. He was not a janitor. He was hired as an electrical engineer. He went to an electronics college. He was a smart guy. He was not a janitor turned genius inventor. He was an electrical engineer who made some cool stuff, and it was actually a pretty normal evolution. But that's sort of, that makes for a good story, right? Like a janitor who becomes a superstar at Nintendo. Have any of you guys heard that, by the way? You've heard that myth? No? Okay. Just a few of you. All right. It bothers me all the time, so I'm glad that it's not as prevalent as I thought it was. But the first thing he made at Nintendo, technically he had sort of given consulting advice on a couple of smaller, forgettable things. But the first thing that he really made was the Ultra Hand. You guys have seen that probably. So the story goes that he just kind of run out of things to do. There wasn't really any maintenance to do, so he was just kind of defaulted back to tinkering, and he made this little stretchy extendable hand toy and was playing with it. President at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, saw him doing that and was like, come into my office. And he was like, oh god, I'm gonna get fired for messing around at work. But instead he was like, oh, this looks really cool, can you make this a game? And I don't know, there's not really much of a game to a stretchy hand, but he made it work. They marketed this as a toy, and it was very cheap. It was like 500 yen, which is like $5, and people really, really liked it. I mean, back in the 60s, it was more like, I don't know, $10-15, but you get the point. So this was definitely the first like real Gunpei Yokoi toy, and it kind of perfectly describes the kind of stuff that he makes too. So there's nothing particularly high-tech about this toy. There's nothing particularly interesting even about it. It's just simply a fun thing. He saw that people got joy out of growing and shrinking this hand, and he was like, look, I can grab my cigarette from over there and try to light it, and it's just a fun, weird thing, and that's sort of exactly what he's all about. So he made several toys throughout the years, really, I mean, tons of them before Nintendo got into any sort of real electronics. The Love Tester, of course, some of you guys have heard of. This was not so much a toy, but more like he marketed this, or he envisioned this as a way to get a girl to hold your hand. He's like, look, guys, this, see how compatible you are. The 10 billion barrel, you guys remember how huge, obviously, the Rubik's Cube was in, the late 70s, early 80s. This was sort of his answer to that. Lots of little puzzles were starting to try to, emulate the success of the Rubik's Cube. And actually, this was the second best-selling puzzle in Japan, the 10 billion barrel. What's funny about this one is that he did not know how to, how Rubik's Cubes like have a solution, like there's a way to actually figure out how to do it. He didn't know what that was for the 10 billion barrel. He's like, well, if they start in the right order and then you shake it up and they're no longer in the right order, surely there must be a way to get them back together again. And there was, and someone approached him later and told him about it, and he was like, oh yeah, of course, obviously, that was the intention. And one of my favorites here is the Lefty RX. This is an RC car, which were quite expensive back in the day. And he found a way, he was like, how can I make this cheaper? What's our spin that we can put on it? So he was able to save about almost 40% of production costs by letting it only turn left. Because what else do you need your RC car to do? Like, you don't necessarily need it to drive in both directions. You're going to be driving it in a circle mostly. And if you take a really tight left turn, then that's kind of a right turn, right? So, but this is the kind of, to me that also is a very Gunpei Yokoi invention, because it's just like, how can we take only what's necessary in order to save money and make a better product? Then we get into some of the kind of more high-tech stuff. So the light guns, this was definitely like a really new concept back in the day. If you guys don't know a whole lot about gun culture in Japan, the short version is that they just don't do it. They don't really have guns at all. It's very difficult to get a gun, but people still enjoyed the idea of guns. So there's like airsoft and that sort of thing, and people liked what do you call that? Like you shoot the clay discs thing. Thank you. And so he was like, well, how can we sort of emulate this experience, but in more of a toy? I love that this box art has like what looks like a 5 or 6 year old with a very realistic looking gun. But the way this came about was a salesperson for Sharp Electronics, Sharp and Nintendo with a long history going all the way back to like the late 50s. Came over, his name was Masayuki Uemura, which is the hardest name to say, who you guys might know is the creator of the Famicom, or he's in charge of the Famicom project. But at the time, he was just a salesman for Sharp, and he came over and was meeting with the head of the research and development department, which at the time that was pretty much just Gunpei Yokoi, and was like, I have this thing, I have this photocell technology, and you hit it with light and it registers. It can register a beam of light. What can we do with it? So this was sort of, the evolution of it. And originally, the plans that they had brought over was quite expensive technology. But by the time that they had worked on it enough, it was only like, I don't know, $2,500 or sorry, not 2,500 yen, excuse me, which is pretty cheap for a toy like this, except for this rifle set, which was like $200. But anyway, so basically it was, you had a target, which would be sold separately, and it had, the gun itself didn't really do anything. It simply was registering that light, like that it was lining up with this photocell. So it was a pretty interesting way of doing it, because it certainly seemed like you were shooting, but you weren't really doing anything. You were like moving a little lever on the inside of the gun, and that was just about it. But this evolved into something that could have been really cool, and was really cool for the very short amount of time that it was around, which is the laser clay system. So the president of Nintendo approached him, was like, could this gun technology be used in real shooting competitions? Can we make this like a real sport? And he said, yeah, but you're gonna have to buy me a gun, because I gotta try this out. I gotta get a real feel for, what these professional shooters and stuff, like what that experience is like. And like I had said earlier, it's very difficult to buy a gun in Japan. It's not really something that's done. So Nintendo, as part of their, accounting line items, was a gun. They bought him a gun. And he went shooting, and he found it really fun, and he learned about how, there's a trajectory, and you can't shoot at exactly where you see it. You sort of have to predict the movement. And when you think about this from an electronic standpoint, that's actually kind of interesting, because it's not, you're not lining it up with what you're seeing, but instead you have to program a way that sort of predicts the future of the trajectory and allow you to, be a few steps ahead of the of where the target appears to be on the screen. So this was really cool. They converted old bowling alleys into these big, like, light gun, I don't know what you would call it. It's kind of like an arcade. Like, it's just tons of light guns in a row, and there would be shooting competitions, there were scores and everything. And they got tons and tons of orders to make these. There were, lots of people wanted to have something like this in their town, and they were converting these old bowling alleys. And then in 1973, as they were making all of these, everyone suddenly pulled their orders. The oil shock of 1973 caused a whole lot of economic problems, not just in Japan, but a lot of places around the world, and everyone was really worried about kind of financial future. And so literally almost every order that they had, millions and millions of dollars worth of laser clay systems were pulled, but they were still manufacturing them. So they went into a lot of debt. And the debt would not be paid until the Game & Watch. So it was actually quite a while of pretty severe debt for them. Thankfully, the Game & Watch came along. Have you guys heard the story of how he saw a man on a train playing with a calculator? And that's sort of where he got the idea. Okay. So the story goes, he was sitting on a train and he saw a businessman just kind of, to, I guess, relieve his boredom, just kind of pushing buttons randomly on a calculator and clearing them and doing math over and over again. He's like, well, that's boring, but what if it wasn't boring? What if there was something cool to do while you were waiting? But it was something he was like, I don't know if that's such a great idea. I'll just kind of think about it. So one of the most interesting things I thought, and that, this is, I've never heard anyone really talk about this, is that the Game & Watch probably would not have happened if it weren't for a really awkward car ride he had to share with the president of Nintendo. So normally, Hiroshi Yamauchi would have like a chauffeur to, a driver to take him to various meetings and that sort of thing with other electronics companies in Japan. Well, his driver was sick. And so they were like, well, you're the only other guy with a car. You're going to have to take him. And he's like, this is ridiculous. I'm the director of research and development. Like, I'm a senior member here. I should not be driving people around. And they're like, well, sorry, you kind of have to. So Yamauchi is a very kind of surly man, or was a very surly, not talkative, very stoic guy. And so he's like, oh my God, what am I going to talk about with this guy? I have to share this like 30-minute car ride with him. And it's going to be so awkward. So he just kind of started rambling. He was like, I have this idea about a calculator that's big and has games on it. And Yamauchi was just kind of like, okay. So he thought that was the end of it. And a couple weeks later, someone from Sharp was just kind of standing in the office, and he was like, what are you doing here? And he goes, well, I'm here to talk about your calculator game. What, so anyways, the whole thing ended up just being a random kind of side note, so it wasn't something he went and presented to his boss. It wasn't something that was, very formally put in, but obviously this is a big turning point for Nintendo. It got them out of their debt. It established them as like a game maker, even starting to be a video game maker. And so when he started development on this, he realized, okay, well, I want to help adults and businessmen and stuff be able to, have fun on their train ride, on their commute, whatever. But also, it's really embarrassing for an adult to play a video game, right? No, but that was actually, kind of what he was thinking. He's like, well, no one's gonna want to be seen playing a video game, so we've got to make this small enough you can just kind of like between your knees, so that no one could see you playing this thing. And that was a really big part of the design for this. So 60 total Game & Watch games were made. A ton of stuff came out of it, including the D-pad, which was really just, how can we put Donkey Kong on something flat? How do we flatten a joystick? We can't. So if that was sort of the answer to that question. 2 screens, it's the first time that Nintendo had a thing with 2 screens. And it might have saved Sharp from, I don't know about going out of business, but it certainly saved them from a bunch of economic troubles, because they were in a calculator war with Casio, and they were losing badly. So this gave them something to, make a whole lot of, and kind of helped them out of a bad economic situation. And then we move all the way over to the Game Boy, of course, which everyone knows, and everyone knows. I think when people think of Gunpei Yokoi, they think of him as the creator of the Game Boy, and which is sort of true. He was definitely in charge of the project. He definitely made a lot of decisions on the product, but of all the things I've talked about so far, this is probably the one that had the most like group effort going on, as whereas a bunch of the other ones were very much him and him only. And this is, and as well as the Game & Watch here, this is where we really, really see what he calls his like overall philosophy, design philosophy, which is called lateral thinking with withered technology. And I know it sounds kind of boring, but it's very, very important. And it's essentially, not using the newest technology, not worrying about being top of the line, but instead using something that has been on the market for quite a while, that we've perfected, that we've been able to make really cheap, and finding a different use for it, a new way to make it exciting, a new way to, make it interesting to a consumer. And the thing that he was inspired by was carbon fiber, which was originally like used for military stuff, and then eventually it was cars, and nowadays it's on like golf clubs and like, just all kinds of random consumer objects. So that's sort of the same idea here, this lateral thinking with withered technology, that he applied to the Game Boy. When you're looking at making something that's sort of the next step to the Famicom, your consumers are not going to want to pay more for a system that is worse. And you couldn't really make a literal portable Famicom at this point, not for any amount of money that was reasonable at the very least. So how could they make something that was going to be cheaper? You had to add a screen, and you couldn't make it more expensive than what you already had out there because it wasn't going to be quite as good. Less powerful but more expensive was obviously not going to work. So that was kind of an immediate okay, well, we've got to go with a monochrome screen then. And this was very much that lateral thinking with withered technology. You take a screen that's definitely not the best on the market. There were definitely color screens available, and there's backlit screens available, but they would have been very, very expensive. And then a real interesting thing about this is something I didn't know until I started my research. He said that the Game Boy, the development of the Game Boy almost drove him to suicide. And I'll tell you a little bit about that story. Essentially, when he was developing the Game & Watch, you look at the Game & Watch, like I was saying, you're looking straight down at it because you're kind of playing it by your knees. You're sort of being discreet about it, I guess, a little bit. And there's a very specific viewing angle for LCD screens. I'm sure you guys have tried to play many games, and if you look, if you hold something at a certain angle, you don't really see it very well. The contrast kind of goes bad. So when he got the prototype of this, he still had it at that angle, but no one plays Game Boy completely flat, right? Like when everyone plays it, you kind of have it at an angle, right? You're holding it like this rather than like that. Does that make sense? Well, it turns out that he said, yeah, go ahead and go, print whatever millions of of screens like this. And when he took the prototype back, they were like, oh my God, you can't see anything on this. So it was very bad. It could have been an extremely expensive mistake. Thankfully, Sharp forgot to record the angle at which he was holding it when he said to go ahead and print it. So they just did the experimenting themselves and found the correct one and printed it that way. So that could have been very scary. And he talks about how that took like a solid 2 weeks out of his life where he just didn't eat. He was so obsessed with this mistake that could have put Nintendo pretty seriously in some, financial jeopardy there. So when he put out the Game Boy, he knew what the other players in the market would do. He was like, we've got this Game Boy, and you can see the technical limitations very clearly. Number one, there's not a color screen, and you can definitely have a color screen. So, we're limiting ourselves. And he was like, this is how the other players are going to try to differentiate themselves. And I know they're going to fail because I know how expensive that is, and I know how much battery power that takes up. And that is exactly what happened. So this is a recreation of a comic that ran in a Japanese gaming magazine. It's the Game Gear, Sega Game Gear, and he's giving a little speech about how much better he is, and then shuts off halfway through the speech. So he printed this and hung it in his office because he was like, I called it. I knew this was going to happen. They were all going to try to do better. And, it's not fun if you have to be connected to your wall all the time. It's not a handheld at that point, or it's not a portable at that point. I guess it's still a handheld, but that's not the point, right? Like to just play it in your home on a smaller screen. Your Genesis is right there. Why would you want that? So anyways. And now we're moving to the Virtual Boy, which I'm sure a lot of you guys have a lot of thoughts on. So at this point, he's been with Nintendo a long time. He's seen a ton of their stuff. I've completely skipped, like I said, I've skipped a whole lot of stuff. He worked on Donkey Kong. He worked on a ton of games. He did Super Mario Land, Metroid, all kinds of other stuff. He's in his 50s at this point. And he's like, Nintendo's really trending towards this, like, hardcore video game market here. We're not having as much fun anymore. We're not innovating as much. He's kind of thinking of retiring. He's like, I kind of want to get out of here and do my own fun stuff again and do toys and weird things that not everybody is gonna, that's not just for the hardcore audience. I know it sounds weird calling Nintendo hardcore, but it's more that they were trying to be a very serious, they were a very serious player in the game industry, and especially at this point, it's the 90s. So yeah, like no one's innovating. It's all graphics, it's all performance, and no one's having fun anymore. So his idea of the Virtual Boy is quite different than what it was actually marketed as. Did anyone actually want a Virtual Boy when they were growing up? Oh, okay, all right. But then did you actually try one and change your mind? Yeah, okay. So his idea of the Virtual Boy is that it's not for like people who are really into video games. It's for people who, they like the basics and they just kind of want a fresh perspective on that. It's a reimagining of simple video game concepts. It's pinball, but instead of being confined to this very flat space, you can see all the way up the board at like the correct angle, right? Like it was just a weird, different way to experience games. And so he called it, this limitless playground. You've got kind of, I know it's not like 3D in the sense that we have 3D now, but it was two screens. It was projecting two different images, and it appeared to be 3D. And originally it was going to be worn more like sunglasses and not that giant monstrosity. But the reason it wasn't like that was because it generated a lot of noise unless you had this big, the big headset that was, I forget what exactly, I think it was like electromagnetic feedback was what he said, but I'm not a technical person, so if that sounds stupid, that's probably just me being wrong. And the sunglasses thing was kind of cool. At least, you could move around. You don't have to be like confined to craning your neck on a table like this, right? And I know you guys all saw the multiple warnings all over the Virtual Boy that's like, stop, this is bad for you. Turn it off. Don't play for very long. Well, it turns out, so they did some research after the Virtual Boy had already released and after they already had to put out all those warnings. They did some research, and what came back was actually that the reason your eyes hurt is because they're getting a workout. Not because you're hurting your eyes. You're not going to go blind playing the Virtual Boy. I don't necessarily think that I don't know if that would have made or break, that would have made the Virtual Boy a totally different experience, but it's an interesting angle, right? If they could have promoted this as like exercising your eyes, right, rather than hurting your eyes, I mean, that might have had some sort of weird, in the same way we have things like Brain Age and stuff, like maybe people would have liked that. Maybe people would have wanted to try it. And so he has his regrets about the thing. He believes that it was marketed all wrong, that it was being, I saw ads. I remember seeing ads that were like, "It's virtual reality." Well, it's not, and he knew it wasn't virtual reality. And that wasn't what he wanted to market it as. He wanted to market it as like an interesting toy where you could experience things in a different way that you've experienced them before. It still is like, the red and the black's still not great. I'm not saying that would have changed the whole course of history there had he had his way, but it's some things to think about at the very least. So he was already planning on leaving Nintendo. We said that earlier. He was in his 50s, and he's like, I'm just going to do one more weird Nintendo thing before I leave. An innovative thing that's kind of different than what we're doing. And obviously that didn't work. So he's like, he whipped up the Game Boy Pocket real fast and then left. So he wasn't leaving on such a bad note. And he immediately started his new company, which is Koto Laboratories, and he took a bunch of Nintendo people with him. And immediately after he left, he had become kind of famous in the toy and games sphere. And so he immediately had a bunch of contracts from other companies who were like, make weird stuff for us. So the place was half contracts that were actually bringing in some money, and then half what he described as like a mad scientist house. He was making really weird trinkets that weren't necessarily for sale in the same way that they wouldn't be on the same shelves as the Nintendo stuff. He had some things like little tiny coin counters where you'd push to release a certain amount of yen, or like a couple of piggy banks where when you deposit a coin, the two pigs kiss. Like, it's just very weird, gimmicky, and it is not supposed to be like, he had all these things that weren't necessarily supposed to be sold commercially, but more so like, here's a weird giveaway that'll make you stand out as a company. So they would take it to like a supermarket or something like that and say, don't you want to put your logo on this and just have this odd giveaway that'll make people remember you? And that's, I think that's like actually a pretty interesting way of doing things. So we had these LCD keychains that you guys, they're kind of like Tamagotchis, but with puzzle games on them, if you guys have seen similar things. And really, Koto, this Koto Laboratories was what Nintendo sort of was in the Gunpei Yokoi years, like in the toy years and in the early Game & Watch years, where it's just kind of weird, withered technology stuff. And of course, they were working on a secret project at the same time, which is the Wonderswan. In this photo right here, this is the company. It looks like an old house. It's got like, it just looks like a traditional Japanese house, but this is where they were making electronics. So, unfortunately, he passed away in 1997. He was driving with a colleague of his. A van flipped in front of them. They crashed into the van. They got out to inspect the damage, and they were hit by a car. His colleague lived, but he did not. There was a private funeral that was attended by 500 people, Nintendo employees, Shigeru Miyamoto, Hiroshi Yamauchi. People say that was the only time they've ever seen him cry. And people really began to recognize his name kind of after his death. Like I had said earlier, he didn't really do that many interviews. He didn't really do a lot of public appearances, at least not in the real Nintendo years. He did back when they were like doing toys and stuff, but once they started transitioning, Game & Watch forward, he was very much behind the scenes. And so this is actually his gravestone. If you guys can tell, there's a Triforce up there, kind of in the top right corner. You might be like, wait, why? He didn't work on Zelda? That's actually his family crest. Yeah, weird, right? I have no idea if that's like related in any way to Zelda. Like that was, if the Triforce of Zelda was inspired by him, I don't really know, but it's weird. And this is my favorite rumor. He was not contracted to be killed by the Yakuza. And I've heard this one a couple times, that the Virtual Boy was just so bad that they had to kill him. No. Or they were mad that he left, but no. Either way, he was on very good terms with everybody, and this is really stupid, so stop repeating it. So when he left Nintendo, he was asking, Shigeru Miyamoto was kind of his like number one disciple at Nintendo. They worked on Donkey Kong together. They were very close. So when he was planning on leaving, he was like, well, what do you intend to do? And Miyamoto said, he was very confident. He's like, I'm going to stay the course. We're working on these like super graphically impressive projects. We're working on, Zelda and all these, like Ocarina of Time, the 3D ones. And he was really excited about this graphically improved future and all of the technology advancements, which, as if you've been paying attention, that's not what Yokoi thinks is important. And so he was just like, all right, man, well, I'm leaving. And Nintendo ended up getting hit kind of hard after Yokoi left. Their next two consoles, it's not that they didn't sink Nintendo, they weren't disasters, but the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube were not good selling consoles compared to their competition. Where the PS1 sold 100 million units, the N64 sold 32, where the PS2 sold like 160 million units, the GameCube sold 22 million. So they were falling pretty hard here in terms of the console wars, and it was because they were really trying to compete at this like graphically impressive level. Let's try to be on the cutting edge. And eventually this kind of led them, and especially Miyamoto, to realize things have to change around here. Gunpei Yokoi was very much about simplifying. He said he was the simplicity and I was the complexity. And when he was gone, I realized I had to change things. We have to kind of go back to his philosophy or we're going to lose this thing. They went from... They were winning with the NES and everything, obviously in a huge way, and then it just kind of was sliding down a little bit. So in 2002, Satoru Iwata took over as president of Nintendo, and they pretty solidly were like, okay, we're going back to our roots, we're going back to what they called Nintendo DNA, and we are going to try to be innovative again and not try to just compete on the cutting edge level. So then they came out with the Wii and the DS, and as you guys know, those were incredibly successful. They weren't trying to compete with the PSP, the PS3, the media experts, if you guys were around at the time and paying attention, they were like, "What? Look at how much more powerful the PSP is than this dinky DS. Why do we need 2 screens? Why are we touching this? Who cares? The PSP, really powerful. That's what's going to matter." And it didn't, because that isn't what matters. What matters is that it's fun and interesting and entertaining, right? Because why would you pick up a game if you're not having fun? And sometimes doing things a little bit differently is a form of fun, even if it's not like, there's obviously a lot of really great games on the PSP, but sometimes it's like, well, what can you do with there's some different mechanics going on here. There's some different things at play with the DS. So it was kind of a return to the casual, because what was more casual than playing cards? Nintendo started out as a playing card company. They've always been a casual company. That's how they've always seen themselves, except for those years in the 90s where they tried to be on the cutting edge. And another thing that he has left with the company is that there's a lot of lasting impacts in the management perspective. Japanese business dealings are very, very rigid. It's very difficult to talk to your superiors when you're in a Japanese company. It's difficult to be heard and say, here are my ideas. And he was very much, starting out as just a guy who fixed the machines and stuff at Nintendo. He was very aware of the fact that he, someone took a chance on him and let him create and let him build, and it worked out really well. So he was like, we need to empower the employees. If they have an idea, we need to listen to them. Just because someone's really smart doesn't mean that they're going to be good to be in charge of a project. We need to have someone there who listens. And these all seem like pretty obvious things now, but especially even in America back in like the 70s, it just wasn't as friendly in an office environment, right? You can't just walk up to someone who's your boss 3 times over and say, here's my idea, right? But he really tried to make that happen. And of course, you also have the Iwata Asks interviews that he did when he was alive, where he would he would talk to everyone on different projects, and he would publish the interviews and try to really understand what was going on there, what was going through their heads, what their ideas were. And this was very, very much the kind of thing that Gunpei Yokoi would have liked to do. Is this my last slide? I think it is. Okay. So as you guys can see, this is he's sort of like the DNA of Nintendo. It's got to be fun. It's got to be interesting. The Switch is a really good example of this, of course, and pretty much everything past the GameCube has been in on this pretty well. Now, they haven't all done quite as well, but they've all been pretty innovative since then. So I guess I will leave this here. This didn't take quite as long as I thought it would, but I've got plenty of time for questions now, so thank you. Well, I will say that there have been several attempts at virtual reality type things that are completely separate than that, but that have, what is the Victor Max, which was run on like Super Nintendo and Genesis, and some things where, technically speaking, it was a lot more oppressive than the Virtual Boy, but people hated it and no one bought it. So it's hard to say whether or not, I would have to actually like look into that a little bit more, but just because you know, just because it was in color and head tracking and all that stuff doesn't necessarily mean that it would have done better than the Virtual Boy, but it's an interesting thing to think about for sure. I am. Oh, I think I just skipped the... Oh, okay. I was like, I knew I was missing something. There we go. Yeah, no, let me talk about the Wonderswan. This is great. So this is another thing that, this was being worked on prior to his death, and of course came out after he died. But had already been, he had filed most of the patents involved with it, and he did develop most of this. But of course, when it comes to the games and pretty much anything that happened after its release, that's very much not him. Although it was, according to his colleagues, very much infused with his kind of, his line of thinking. The most important, I think, being that it was the most transparent, open console of all time. To my knowledge, it was that you could buy a dev kit. Like, anyone could buy a dev kit. And that's weird. That's not something that other consoles let you do. So you could buy this thing called the Wonder Witch, and you literally could develop a game. And they ran 2 competitions where people would vote on these games that just one guy or whatever made in his bedroom, and 2 of them got published. And they're, of course, the 2 most expensive Wonderswan games right now. Judgment Silver Sword and Dicing Knight, if you guys have heard of those. But those were both people who had a dev kit, who purchased a dev kit, developed it on their own. They weren't game studios, they weren't professionals, and submitted it, and it won. So that's a really cool thing that the Wonderswan has that other consoles really don't. And they also did a bunch of weird, unique accessories. The Wonderborg is a programmable robot bug that you control with your Wonderswan. The handy sonar is literally a fishing sonar for your Wonderswan. This is a real thing. I own one. And and it works. Yeah, on your screen you see where the fish are and everything. And I don't have the data of exactly why it was made, but I imagine that if you already have the computer as it is, the Wonderswan has computing power to it, then you can just have the sonar part, and it's probably a cheaper process than buying an entire sonar system. I have no idea who it's for or who bought it, but that's anyway, so that's does that answer your question? Because I totally forgot about the slide. He was a big fisherman, yeah. I wish I knew. But yeah, that's certainly possible. There were some other things too. There's the mobile Wonder Gate, so you could take your Wonderswan kind of online through your cell phone, manage emails and that sort of thing through that. So that was obviously pretty innovative as well. Sure. So the transparency is part of it, and then the other part is you guys have seen a Wonderswan. Some games are played vertically, and some games are played horizontally, and that is really weird, and is not. I don't think that's happened again. Well, I guess sort of the Switch now, right? With the flip grip. But anyways, it opens the possibility for a more creative game development. So the way, because you can do it both horizontally and vertically, this is meant to sort of open the doors to thinking about your handheld differently, thinking about developing. It's not just, let's try to cram an NES game onto a small screen and make it portable and try to make it work as best we can. Let's try to find a totally new way to think about things. Let's try to make, wouldn't Tetris play better if your screen was long and skinny like that? And obviously that's like a real, that's an example of something that already exists, but it's, how how can we use something like this to make a more creative game? And so, there's some Judgment Silver Sword is a vertical shoot 'em up, so you play it vertically rather than horizontally. And there's a couple examples of things like that. That's true. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, one of the Mega Man games switches. But I mean, you're not totally wrong, and I think part of that is because he died before this thing was like even remotely market ready. So I have no idea if it was just sort of wrapped up and let's try to emulate him as much as possible by making it Game Boy like, and how much of it was like his creativity in it. But I think those two things, the being able to develop both vertically and horizontally, and making it really transparent for people to add their own creative stuff to it, I think those are probably like the big things. All the way back there. Oh, actually, so fairly well. Obviously, nothing was going to catch up to the Game Boy. And this is a console that was only released in Japan and then briefly in South Korea as well. It captured 11% of the market share for handhelds. So 11% does not sound bad to me. That's like pretty decent. And they had contracts with Bandai and with, of course, Bandai because they helped publish the Wonderswan, but so there's Gundam games and all of that, and then also with Square Enix. So like Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all on the Wonderswan, and Arc the Lad, and like some other random stuff like that. The Saga series. Yeah. Anything else? Sure. Yeah. There's a bunch of puzzle games and platformers that are perfectly fine to play. Gunpei, which is named after him, the puzzle game, is entirely in English. It's just menu, that happens to be in English. And this happens sometimes with Japanese games. It's sometimes just easier to make the whole thing in English because everyone can read it. And I don't know if maybe that was because they were planning on taking to the States, or it's just like, everyone can read this. It doesn't matter. But yeah, there's lots of puzzle games. There's quite a few platformers. So, but there's also a lot of RPGs. So stay away from those, I guess. Yeah, there definitely is a little bit. There's a database, and I'm blanking on the name, but there's a place where it's pretty much just a big list of all of the, people can submit whatever they want from their Wonder Witch. And it's cool too, because it came with actual, you could buy rewritable cartridges. You could buy like several of them, and you could just kind of give games to your friends that you made. It's such a cool thing. I wish other consoles did that. That's a good question, because I know I read this at one point and I am completely forgetting. I know the swan part comes from like swan song, like the idea of something being your like. Yeah, like I'm pretty sure he didn't name it that. I'm pretty sure that was a. And I'm not sure about the wonder part, but the swan part was, to my knowledge, supposed to be sort of a, because this is Gunpei Yokoi's swan song. What? Oh, the witch part? I'm gonna go with something like, brewing something. It's homebrew, witches. Yeah, that's my guess. I'm totally making that up, but that sounds right to me, so we're gonna go with it. Swan crystal, yeah. Yep. Yeah, and of course everything, color and crystal, that was well past his death, and I'm sure I don't think he even probably had an inkling of an idea of doing it also in color or doing it with a better screen or whatever. I think, you know, you focus on one thing at a time, right? So this would have come out and then they would have made decisions based on feedback and sales and all of that. And I'm sure that was all just the people at Koto, you know, after he was gone. Oh yeah, yeah. That's just it's transparent. So mhm. So this is start, and then this is a sound button. It's just for decreasing and increasing the sound, and that was changed on later systems, on later iterations of this. The reason we have these weird buttons over here is because basically when you're playing it in horizontal mode, you can just ignore these buttons up here. They don't do anything typically. And then when you flip it, if you can imagine this flipped, you have your D-pad becomes the one on the left, and this becomes your like other buttons here. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of buttons involved, but it's just to deal with the, you know, the issue of where do we put the buttons when it's in this position versus when it's in this position. The last title at Nintendo. It might have been. No, I don't know off the top of my head. No, I don't know. I'm sorry. But he did do a lot. He did a lot of. I'm guessing it's probably a Virtual Boy thing, but possibly also a Game Boy thing because he was doing the Game Boy Pocket at that same time. He did a lot of ones that you guys are probably very familiar with. He did Dr. Mario, Yoshi's Egg, Metroid, Super Mario Land. And these weren't all, like, it wasn't just him on most of those things because he wasn't really a software developer. Actually, since we have a little bit of time, I'm going to tell you a Donkey Kong story because he was the guy who, you guys know the origin of Donkey Kong, the arcade machine? That basically they had too many of an arcade machine and they were like, find some way to, yeah. So he was the one who put a really young designer, Shigeru Miyamoto, on it, who was at the time just doing like game packaging. He hadn't really worked on a game properly yet. And they were originally trying to do like a Popeye thing. And then they couldn't get the rights to Popeye. And that's, if you guys are familiar with that story, basically there's an episode of Popeye where Olive Oil sleepwalks through a construction site. And that's sort of where the setting of Donkey Kong came from. That's why there's all these like ladders and all of that. So they couldn't get the rights to that, so they're like, okay, well, let's try to come up with something else. What's really interesting to me that Gunpei Yokoi says, and he says this in an interview, and I don't know, the implications of this are really big, and that's why I hesitate to say it because I don't know if it's true or not. The only proof I have is that he said it once. When they were working on it, they were originally saying, okay, well, to avoid the barrels, you have to climb up a ladder. There was no jumping. You just climb up the ladder to avoid it and climb back down. He says that he was the one who had the idea to jump. That's huge, because that's kind of what makes Donkey Kong Donkey Kong. Wouldn't you guys say? Like, the jumping part was new, and that was exactly. So, I I purposefully did not put that story in here because I almost want to give Miyamoto a chance to, like, say if that's true or not, because like, in my mind, that makes Gunpei Yokoi the creator of Donkey Kong. Like, really, because it's not, I don't think it would have done very well if all you had to do was just run away, climb up a ladder real quick, try to advance it. Like, that's not nearly as fun. That's slow, that's frustrating. I don't think it would have been a cult hit at that point. So, anyways, that was a random side note, but it's an interesting story, so. They're mostly just making kind of weird Tamagotchi-like devices. It's the puzzles, like little keychain puzzles and that sort of thing. I don't think they're doing anything much more than that. They're definitely a small company. But that was the last I checked. They definitely still have a website. They're still doing stuff, and I know that they do consulting on electronics projects as well, but they're not like as transparent about that on their website, so I'm not totally sure of the details. We got a few more minutes. Yeah. So a lot of this information did come from a book about his life, which if you guys are like, wait, what? There's a book about his life? Yeah. So it was written when he was still alive. So it was written in, I want to say, 96, and by a Japanese guy. So the book is entirely in Japanese. And after he died, people started scrambling to get this biography, and there weren't, it didn't sell very well at first. It was out of print. It's an insanely rare book. It's like several $100s if you can ever find it. But in 2005-ish, a French guy translated it into French and re-released it with some kind of, after death notes. Have you guys heard of the company Pix and Love? It's a book publishing place. So that it was from those guys. Now I don't really know. I hear they're kind of coming back, but for whatever the case is, this book is out of print. It's only in French. I did translate the entire thing. I don't speak French. I use Google Translate. It took a very long time. It's just called Gunpei Yokoi. I don't think it really has much of a tagline. I'll try to double check here. But yeah, good luck finding it, because it took me a long time. Well, I'm sure they can't. I'm sure you can't, because you can't just take someone else's work and translate it and republish it. Yeah, that would be great. I agree. But yeah, so a lot of this information did come from that, because like I said, he did not interview very often. So I did go through all of the interviews that I could find with him. But they're, at least in like a reachable sense, without finding someone who used to work at Nintendo, there's just not a whole lot out there. And at the very least, all of the stuff in this book came from his mouth. So he said it out loud, and that's as much as we know. And that's why I've said in a couple of these things, like, he claimed, because he's telling a story, and it's his autobiography, or it's his biography. He's probably trying to make himself look kind of good. So I'm not 100% sure that absolutely everything he said is not embellished in any way, shape, or form. But, there's still a lot of stuff in there that is definitely true, so. I think we got time for like one more question. No. So that's another thing, is people are like, Nintendo was very mad at him. So let me try to contextualize this a little bit. So this is a guy who basically made Nintendo. They were just making playing cards, and he was the first guy to start making things that weren't playing cards. And he was the first guy to start making, like, real electronics that were more sophisticated than just, like, a battery-powered radar scope and random, like, weird toy-like things. The Game & Watch was, like, a pretty significant piece of gaming history, right? Like, that was really part of the, like, turning the tide into handhelds, right? So they did, the Virtual Boy didn't do well, obviously, and it was not a good look for Nintendo. But considering the history he has with Nintendo, he got them out of debt, he changed, what their focus is as a company. No, he was on very good terms with everybody. So there's a whole lot of, like, I think it's because he didn't interview very often, there's just a whole lot of, like, random rumors about him. Like he was killed by the Yakuza one. All right, well, I think that is time. Thank you guys so much.